In this video, we are going to review some of the other titles that Fitzgerald considered for The Great Gatsby and look at how each title shows us different elements of the novel.
Beware, there are spoilers in this video. Do not keep watching unless you finish reading The Great Gatsby.
Thank you, Cody, for that warning. All right, so close out if you haven't finished reading yet. We're going to get started. The process of writing The Great Gatsby and publishing The Great Gatsby took Fitzgerald a few years in the 1920s, so you should have already looked at the background between Zelda and Scott to give yourself a good foundation for this. But in 1922, the Fitzgeralds moved to a place called Great Neck on Long Island, which was where prominent and newly wealthy New Yorkers were settling down. And opposite Great Neck was a place called Manhasset Neck, which was where the established families lived, where the wealthiest of America's aristocracy lived. So there was like a real life East Egg and West Egg, which exemplified the difference between old money and new money, that they were not the same. You can buy wealth, but you can't buy class. And that was something that started to inspire Fitzgerald's writing. So he started to work on his novel in 1923, but hit a lot of writer's block and problems and scrapped most of it. So in 1924, he and Zelda moved to the French Riviera. They left America, and his relationship with her was really starting to deteriorate. And that's the situation in which he wrote The Great Gatsby. So it was published in 1925 after many revisions and many edits, and he struggled to pick a title all the way up until publication. And really, he got stuck with the title, The Great Gatsby. The novel had already gone to print, and he tried to change it at the last minute, but it was too late to update it at the printers. And so this title, The Great Gatsby, was one that he considered only fair, rather bad than good. So we're going to review some of the other titles that he considered for his most famous novel. He considered The High-Bouncing Lover and Gold-Hatted Gatsby. He considered Among the Ash Heaps and Millionaires. He considered Trimalchio and West Egg, On the Road to West Egg, and Under the Red, White, and Blue. The first titles we're going to look at are The High-Bouncing Lover and Gold-Hatted Gatsby. This is the epigraph of the novel, and an epigraph is a short quotation or saying that comes at the beginning of a book that starts to suggest the book's themes. This comes from Thomas Parkden Villiers, and it says, "Then wear the gold hat if that will move her. If you can bounce high, bounce for her too, till she cry, 'Lover, gold-hatted, high-bouncing lover, I must have you.'" And this person, Thomas Parkden Villiers, is actually another character that Fitzgerald created in another of his novels. So his epigraph, he's really quoting himself from a previous work, but it is entirely symbolically applicable to the major themes of The Great Gatsby. So both of these titles articulate the romantic aspect of the story, which is Gatsby's love for Daisy. He sets aside his morals, reason, even self-preservation in his quest to bounce high enough for her. He basically loses himself in his crusade to win Daisy. For 5 years, he collects every news clipping about her that he can find, and in his mind, the only things keeping he and Daisy apart are his lack of status, his lack of wealth. And so to bounce high enough for Daisy, Gatsby needs money. He needs that gold hat. He resorts to bootlegging, to ambiguous other illegal activities. He has connections to organized crime. And so he goes from being Mr. Nobody from nowhere to being this wealthy, mysterious proprietor of crazy popular parties in Long Island. And all of this is done for Daisy. But even after he wins her affections, they start having their affair, he doesn't stop chasing her. He doesn't ever feel like he has her. He needs her to say that she never ever loved Tom. And even after Myrtle's unfortunate, horrible death, Gatsby doesn't give her a second thought. He doesn't give Myrtle even a second thought after they run her over. His mind is only on Daisy and on her mental health after the accident. Even though she was the only one responsible for Myrtle's death, Gatsby is not responsible for Myrtle's death at all. And so everyone assumes he's driving, and if he had spoken up, he would have prevented his own death. And the fact that he doesn't speak up to save himself is like another effort, another bounce to prove himself worthy of Daisy. So one of the other things that the Gold-Hatted Gatsby highlights is Fitzgerald's use of color imagery and symbolism. There are a lot of colors that Fitzgerald incorporates into the imagery in his story, and gold is arguably one of the most important. Gold symbolically represents wealth, which is really not a stretch. Hopefully that connection is already being made in your mind. And so the gold hat that the poem's lover is striving for is not just money, but power and distinction and that old aristocracy name that Greatforth can hopefully afford him. If you remember, throughout the story, Jordan Baker is described as having slender golden arms, and the light on the Buchanan's mansion glows with reflected gold. Daisy even uses a gold pencil for writing addresses. And Daisy herself is described as being the golden girl. She's the embodiment of that wealth and of that status. And so Gatsby tries to emulate this wealth. He tries to emulate this golden imagery. But he just can't. He has a yellow car. Yellow is like poor man's gold, and there's a line at one of his parties where he manages to bewitch some things to like a pale gold, but ultimately his efforts to appear to have that status come off as contrived and fake. This next title, Among the Ash Heaps and Millionaires, stresses the wealth ideas that Gold-Hatted Gatsby had, but it also hits on a few other motifs from the novel. And the first is this idea of being among millionaires, but being different from, for one reason or another. They're with them, but they're not like them. So both Gatsby and Caraway can be considered to be like among millionaires, but having a very different mindset or a different class. And so the difference between Gatsby's wealth and millionaires like the Buchanans is that Gatsby had to earn his wealth and the Buchanans simply inherited theirs. Gatsby owns the Rolls Royce and the mansion and is constantly insecure with his position in the upper class. He feels the need to parade his wealth before Daisy. Remember, he takes her on that tour of the property and he goes on almost like a rant when he's like pulling out all of his different colored shirts, and she ends up crying, and we'll talk about that later, about why she cries. But if he had really belonged in the same class as the millionaires, he wouldn't have needed the approval of others to validate his fortune. He wouldn't have needed to brag, to show it off, because part of being cool is not acting like you're cool, if that makes any sense. Part of being really, really wealthy is blowing it off and not making a big deal out of it. And so when Tom discovers Gatsby's affair with Daisy, he calls it a presumptuous little flirtation. Like Gatsby of a lower class presumes to have some type of intimacy and relationship with Daisy, who is an entirely different class than he is. So the next guy is Nick, who is definitely different than the millionaires because of his monetary status. He's way poorer than they are, but also his mentality. You know, he lives in that little cardboard bungalow at $80 a month, and when Daisy asks if he's married, he just says, "Oh no, I'm too poor for that." But he's very different than Gatsby because he's not ashamed of his mediocre status. He doesn't ever try to hide it. And, you know, after he has that first dinner with the with the Buchanans, that was a Freudian slip, that's for sure. After his first dinner with the Buchanans, he comes away feeling confused and a little disgusted at their materialistic lifestyle, at their behavior. And even after meeting Myrtle in chapter 2, Nick says that he was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled. So the presence of the ash heaps presents another really important setting in this story. We have the ash heaps, the Valley of Ashes, and it was based on a real place called the Corona Dump, and it was an area filled with trash, ashes, decay, and so it's a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, and men who move dimly already crumbling through the powdery air. So we have this idea of like a lack of vitality, that there is depression and decay throughout everything. Even the people who live there are covered in ash. And so this is not only where George and Myrtle live, but this is where Myrtle dies. This is where we have that physical clash between the millionaires and the lower class. And that definitely was intentional. You know, we had these class dynamics and tensions throughout the whole thing, and it culminates in a physical clash. And so the last piece is the millionaires, and we're talking about the Buchanans because Fitzgerald uses Daisy and Tom to represent this entire upper class, this American aristocracy. He tells us that Tom and Daisy spent a year in France for no reason in particular and drifted here and there unrestfully, wherever people played polo and were rich together, which, oh man, I just love his language. So he says later that they're safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. And, you know, today we would call them the 1%, and we might follow them on Instagram. But Daisy's entire person exudes wealth. Even her voice is said to be full of money. It has a charm in it. She's high in a white palace, the king's daughter, the golden girl. And so they're entirely known by their wealth, by their inherited wealth. So we need to know that status isn't just from money, right? It's from inheriting it, that the true members of the aristocratic class did not have to work to get there. So there's a psychological divide between inherited wealth and earned wealth, and we can see that in East Egg and West Egg. So the Buchanans kind of lower themselves to go to Gatsby's parties on West Egg. But even when they're there, they kind of maintain a separation because they know that they're better than everyone else who's there.